Would you like some tips on how to get vibrant coloured pencil drawings with bright white highlights using some fast and simple techniques? In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how I drew this red panda and give you some of my best tips and techniques that I use to achieve this result. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. Before I get started, if you want to follow along with a real-time version of this tutorial, which is over 4 hours long, where I talk you through every step of the process, then I'll leave a link in the description where you can watch that on my Patreon channel. The first tip is to use a good quality paper. For most of my coloured pencil pieces, I use the Clairefontaine pastel mat, and this is a fantastic paper that will help you be able to add many layers of coloured pencil, which creates a more vibrant result. And this paper also lets you add lighter colours over the darker colours, which can be super hard to do with coloured pencils, so it really makes the process a lot easier because you don't have to work from light to dark or preserve your highlights. I've also got another tip later in the video that shows you how you can add bright white highlights on top of any colour, but I'll go through that in a little bit. I use a variety of coloured pencil brands throughout my coloured pencil pieces, but if I want to get a really rich, vibrant layer of pencil down quite quickly, I like to use the Derwent drawing pencils and blend them with solvent. Solvent is my favourite way of blending coloured pencils because it's easy, takes far less time than other methods, and is easier on your hands and wrists because there isn't an excessive amount of layering or pushing really hard on your pencils to burnish. And the Derwent drawing pencils are a really creamy wax-based pencil that's really quite opaque in comparison to a lot of other coloured pencils. These pencils only come in a set of 24 though, so the colours are very limited, but if you do a lot of wildlife pieces, the colours are kind of natural, which works well with a lot of artwork that I create. So when I'm doing my base layers, I'm trying to block in a more saturated, slightly darker mid-tone colour, which I'll go on top of with my details in the following layers. So to get the most vibrant and saturated result, I try and use the Derwent drawing pencils first, and if that set doesn't have the colour that I'm after, I'll just mix it or layer them with the Caran d'Ache Luminance or the Prismacolor, which are both wax-based pencils. And I like to use the wax-based pencils in the first few layers because they blend out really nicely with the solvent and create a really nice rich colour. When you're working on pastel mat with solvent, your pencil strokes don't have to be super controlled because they'll be blended out pretty well. Some of the pencil strokes do show through in the end result though, so make sure that you're following the direction of any fur or shape that you're drawing, just in case you can see those strokes after it's been blended out. If you're working on other smoother papers or like watercolour paper, you'll need to have more controlled pencil strokes because it will look kind of scribbly or like grainy and messy if you don't work in smaller circular motions that overlap. It can take a really long time to cover larger areas when you work on those other papers because of that reason. Whereas if you work on pastel mat, you can cover a larger area more quickly because you don't have to be super careful with your pencil strokes. And also on the smoother papers, you'll need to have a sharper point to your pencil because the pencil needs to be able to get into all the little grooves of the paper because the solvent doesn't blend it out as well as it does on pastel mat. Whereas when you're working on pastel mat, you can have a pencil that's not that sharp because it doesn't matter too much about filling in all the gaps straight away because when you blend it with the solvent, it really blends it into the tooth of the paper on the pastel mat. So you don't end up wasting your pencil by continuously sharpening it that way. So for my initial layer or my underpainting, I like to add a slightly darker mid-tone colour that's a little bit more vibrant and saturated than I want my end result to be. And that way I can add lighter, more natural colours on top as well as my darker starks, and it will slowly dull down that initial vibrancy of the base layer. But having those more saturated colours there in the first layer, it will show through subtly towards the end and it will give a really nice result. When it comes to using solvent, I tip a little bit in a smaller jar so that I can easily remove the lid and replace it while I'm not working with it, because you obviously don't want to breathe in excess chemicals if you don't have to. So keeping it in a smaller jar also means that if the solvent gets dirty, you wouldn't have contaminated the rest of the solvent as well, because you want to use a clean bit of solvent if you're coming into lighter areas of your work. And if your solvent does get a little bit dirty, you can leave it overnight and let that pigment settle to the bottom of the jar, and then you can just tip out that clean solvent that's on the top into another jar, and that way you don't contaminate your entire bottle that way, and there's always clean solvent to work with. So I like to use an old filbert brush that was used for oil or acrylic painting. You don't want to use one that's too soft like a watercolour brush or too hard like those bristle brushes. Just a generic sort of oil or acrylic brush that isn't expensive, because it will most likely get ruined with this technique as well. I usually just keep the same brushes aside and I use them every time, so it doesn't really matter if they're splayed out or a bit damaged or anything like that. And then when you're ready to actually go in with the solvent, make sure that you dab off the excess on some cloth or paper towel before going onto your artwork, because you don't want to add too much solvent. So your brush should be damp but not dripping, and you'll get used to that the more you work with it, how much solvent you actually need. And when you're applying the solvent, you want to make sure that you follow the direction of the fur or the shape that you're working on with your brush, because the brush strokes will probably show through in the end as well, just like your coloured pencil strokes. So if you want a smoother area, you can work in smaller circles overlapping each other to create a nice smooth result rather than sort of painting up and down. Whereas if you're working on an area like the background here where the snow is falling on a diagonal direction, or in areas of fur, you want to make sure that you follow the same direction with your application as well. So once you're finished adding your solvent, let it completely dry. I usually wait half an hour or so, which is probably excessive because it feels dry within a few minutes, but you definitely don't want to add more layers of pencil if your paper is still wet, because it will damage the paper that way. It depends on how much solvent you use and what kind of paper you're using as to how long it will take to dry. So I always leave it a little bit longer than I think I need to, just in case. A big problem that I see people have when they first start to blend with solvent is that they don't have enough pigment down before they go in to blend. So what happens when you don't have enough layers of pencil down is that there isn't anything for the solvent to blend together. So you end up with this kind of grainy result where nothing really blended very well and the paper is still showing through in some areas. And if that happens, it's not the end of the world, just let it dry and then come back and add more layers before blending again. The beauty of working on pastel mat is that you can add a lot of layers, so you can fix mistakes like that quite easily. So with the layering process, you still want to make sure that you use a light hand throughout the entire project until you get to the end where you know you won't add any more layers. And then when you get to that end layer, you can push a little bit harder in some areas if you want a darker color or anything like that. But if you push hard from the start, you'll actually flatten the tooth of the paper. So all papers have little grooves or like texture that are a bit like hills and valleys, which we refer to as the tooth of the paper. So when you add your pencil, it catches on the hills and then sinks into the valleys. So when you've filled up the valleys with your pigment and it's level with the top of the hills, you won't be able to add any more layers because it's now a slick, even surface with no texture for your pencils to grip onto. So when you use smooth papers like the Strathmore Bristol Smooth or some other drawing papers that are quite smooth as well, they have a very small amount of tooth, so you can't add as many layers as something like pastel mat, which has quite a lot of tooth. And you can also flatten the tooth of the paper by pressing too hard with your pencils, so you won't be able to add any more layers on top. So make sure that you're working in light layers throughout the entire process. If you want to, you can actually do numerous layers blended with solvent, so you can do it more than once if your first result isn't as smooth as you wanted it to be. And I usually use solvent numerous times throughout the process as well. With these techniques, you can use any brand of coloured pencils throughout this process, so you don't have to use all the brands that I have. You can just start with the brand that you already have. You may just need a few more layers to get the saturation level if you're using an oil-based pencil like the Faber-Castell polychromos instead of the wax-based pencils in the first few layers. I find that I like to use the wax-based pencils first, like the Derwent Drawing and the Luminance, because they blend really nicely on this paper with solvent, and then I like using the oil-based pencils like the polychromos for the details on top, because they tend to sharpen to a finer point and they stay sharper for longer as well. But honestly, I mainly choose my pencils based on the colour that I want, so if one set doesn't have the right colour, I'll use it from another set, whether that's oil or wax-based. There's not too much of a difference between the oil and wax-based pencils, but there is a slight difference. So just start with whatever set you have, and then you can do all of these techniques with any set of coloured pencil that you have. So if you find that you've added a lot of layers and your work is still a bit grainy and not as smooth as you want it to be, you can actually use a coloured pencil to smooth out the layers. So coloured pencils all lay down differently depending on the brand and the colour within that brand. So some pencils when you use them tend to look quite grainy, whereas others look really smooth when you lay them down. For example, the warm grey 2 and the cold grey 1 in the Faber-Castell polychromos are really fantastic at blending colours together and making them look smoother, because those pencils are really smooth to begin with, so they're not very grainy when you lay them down, whereas other colours just lay down really grainy. So sometimes I'll come through on top of a few layers to blend out the colours with either of those two greys, because it can really soften any graininess left by other coloured pencils. And I did that on the entire background of this piece with the cold grey 1, just to soften the graininess of that white pencil that I used underneath it. And that's a really common issue with the pastel mat, is that a lot of people don't like how grainy the paper can look in the end, but if you keep adding layers and using those pencils to blend, it can really take away a lot of that graininess. I'm not really too fussed if it looks slightly grainy, because I'm looking at it from a normal viewing distance anyway. I don't really mind if when I'm looking up close, like with my nose pressed against it, that you can see some graininess, but I know that other people really don't like that. So the more layers of pencil that you add, and those kind of pencils to actually blend it a little bit smoother, they can really help combat that graininess if you don't like it. So before I show you my next tip, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then Patreon might be the solution for you. For a small amount per month, you'll have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolour and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using, so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice, or share your artwork and talk to other members in the Patreon community. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. So when you're working on fur, make sure that your pencil strokes are going in the right direction, and really look at your reference photo to see when that direction changes. On areas like the face on most animals, the fur switches directions quite often, so really pay attention to your reference photo to see those changes. You also don't want every stroke to look the same, so even though you're going in the same general direction, you want to make sure that your strokes stop and start at different points and some curve slightly differently in different directions, because if they were all exactly the same, then it can look very unnatural. So the way that I work, and you probably would have noticed by now, is that I work in layers. So with my process, I sort of just block in all the general colours, and then I start adding in the textures on the next few layers, and then I'll start adding in a few of the details within the last few layers. Whereas a lot of people like to work in sections. So for example, they'll start on the face of the red panda, and then they'll do that to completion before moving on to the body, and then they'll like move on to the background or whatever order they want to do it in. Whereas I find that I can't really work like that, because I don't remember what colors I laid down and in what order and like how much of each color, and I just find that my piece doesn't really look cohesive if I work in sections like that. Whereas other people find that when they work in layers like I do, that it's really confusing and overwhelming. So whatever you want to do, like if you want to work in sections, you can do that if you want to, but I prefer to work in layers because it makes more sense in my head. So when it comes to transferring your initial outline, I wouldn't recommend freehanding straight onto pastel mat, because if you continually erase or fix mistakes, it can really damage the paper. So the way that I like to do it is to draw your freehand drawing on a separate piece of paper, like printer paper or just a cheaper drawing paper, or print your reference photo if you're going to trace your reference photo instead. And then you can actually rub pastel on the back of your reference photo or drawing. So I usually use the pan pastel or just like a pastel pencil or a soft pastel stick. And then you can turn your reference photo or your drawing over and then trace the outline onto your pastel mat. And that way it will leave an imprint of the pastel on your pastel mat. The pastel actually blends really nicely with the coloured pencils, so it doesn't muddy up any of your colours like the graphite can sometimes do. You could also pick a pastel colour that matches your drawing as well. You can use transfer paper if you like. I try and pick one that's not graphite based for coloured pencil pieces though, because sometimes the graphite can sort of mix in with the coloured pencil, especially if you're using solvent, and it can sort of muddy up the piece. So if you try and use a transfer paper that's not graphite based, that will work quite well as well. But yeah, the pastel on the back of your reference photo or your outline is a really great way to go. So when I'm working on my artwork, I really like to tape my work down. So there's a few reasons for that. One is so that when you remove the tape, there's a nice border around the outside that you can hold on to that means that you're not touching the actual artwork itself. And it really helps when you're framing things or like storing things. And also when you sell your artwork and you ship it to people, having that nice border around the edge can actually make it look quite nice as well. So although they're probably going to frame it anyway, I think it just looks better, and it's also easier for moving around and things like that. But I also recommend taping your work to a board instead of your desk, so that when you need to get into a certain angle with your hand, you don't have to sort of get into a weird position. You can just rotate your board and get those pencil strokes in that way. So when it comes to colour choices, people tend to worry about their colours a lot, and honestly, colours are not that important. It's your values that matter. I actually used a lot of colours that aren't in the original reference photo for this piece, so I usually hype up the saturation on my reference photos to bring out some more colours that aren't so obvious, and I'll add those to the piece as well. So really, if you're looking at a piece like this and you're trying to find the perfect orange, for example, it doesn't really matter which orange you pick as long as it's the same value. So as long as it's not too dark or too light, it doesn't have to be the exact same orange that you see on the reference photo or the same orange that you see someone who's doing a tutorial is using. You can always pick an orange that is close, and then you can layer colours on top if it doesn't look quite right, or you can just switch to another colour if it doesn't look quite right. So it doesn't really matter if you have the exact same orange, just make sure that it's not too dark or too light. That's all that matters. So if you're trying to make something look more realistic, don't worry too much about the colours. It's actually the values that are the most important, and also making sure that your initial outline is accurate. The colour is way down on the list of importance when it comes to making something look realistic. So if you're not sure whether your values are right, so whether your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are light enough, you can actually just take a picture of your artwork and then turn that into black and white, and then compare that to a black and white version of your reference photo. And when you do that side by side, you can actually see really clearly whether your darks are as dark as the reference photo, and the same with your highlights. Most people don't really have a problem getting their lights light enough. It's usually the darks that they're too scared to go darker with. So by doing this, you can actually see if your artwork needs to be darker, and then you can go and alter your artwork from there. Okay, so this is the fun part where I show you how you can add bright highlights to your coloured pencil pieces. So a lot of people use things like gel pens, acrylic paints, gouache, watercolour pencils where they've wet the tip, and just a range of other materials that can be archival separately when you use them on their own. But as soon as you add those water-based mediums on top of an oil or wax-based medium like coloured pencil, it's not archival anymore. It's literally like adding water to oil, they just don't mix. You may run into archival issues in the future where those highlights will chip off or cause issues. And then again, you may never have any issues using those products as well. So I just don't really want to risk it, and I always use things that are archival and light fast. So there are a few other archival ways to add highlights or whiskers and things like that. Like some people scrape away the layers with a knife to reveal the paper underneath or the lighter layers underneath, which can actually be quite a tricky technique. And it also only lets you do super fine lines. So if you want to add things like snow or like little lumps of white areas, and then you can't really do that very well with that technique. There are also other ways like indenting the paper before you start, which I'm not really a fan of because I don't particularly want indents on my paper, and sometimes when you work on pastel matte with solvent, the pigment tends to fill up the indents anyway. So what I do is mix these two products from the brand Brush and Pencil. So all of their products are archival, and they're actually made with the intention of being used with coloured pencil. The beauty about these products is that you can actually work over the top of them as well to dull down the whiteness of the mixture or to tint it different colours as well. So I'm basically mixing the titanium white powder with the touch-up texture, which is a liquid. So you want to mix this pretty smoothly so that there aren't many lumps, and make it a consistency a bit like milk. And then you can literally paint this onto your artwork to create whiskers or highlights anywhere you want to. If you want a bit more of a brighter, more opaque white, then you can add a little bit more powder, and if you want it to be a little bit more see-through, and then you can add a bit more liquid. These products are also really great if you flatten to the tooth of the paper in any area of your project, because you can actually use that clear touch-up texture liquid by itself in that area, and then once it's dry, it sort of provides this extra layer of tooth that you can add more colour on top of. So if you make any mistakes or you need to add a lot more layers or anything like that, and then you can actually use these products to help with problems like that. It really makes the whole process of working with coloured pencils a lot easier and more versatile. So when it comes to the amount of detail that I add to my work, I really don't actually add that much detail. If you stand back and look at my work from a normal viewing distance, it's gonna look realistic and like it's detailed, but it's actually an illusion because when you look closer or you zoom in on the computer screen, it still has quite a lot of texture and sort of rough pencil strokes. There's not that many fine details on my artwork. For me, I actually like the way that looks, where you can stand back and have it look realistic and detailed, but when you get close, you realize that it's actually not that detailed. And the way that you achieve this is by getting your values right. Like I was talking about earlier, just making sure that your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are light enough is what's going to make it look more realistic. So when I go to museums or art galleries, there are so many paintings there that look realistic from a distance, but when you look closer, all you can see is brush strokes and colours. I think it takes a lot of skill to get your work to look like that as well. So for me, if I stand back and look at my artwork from a normal viewing distance and I can't see the detail that I'm adding, then it probably doesn't need to be there. It's obviously up to you how much detail you want to add, and there's no right or wrong answers to that, but for me, I'd rather create 4 or 5 pieces of painterly looking artwork that still looks realistic from a distance in the same amount of time that it would take me to create one super detailed piece where every single stroke of fur is included. If you want to follow along with the real-time tutorial that's over 4 hours long, I'll leave a link to my Patreon channel in the description. Otherwise, there's a playlist on the screen of some other coloured pencil tutorials that I think you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.